So I've been doing a lot of thinking lately, like I always do. And what I have been thinking about for the last several months, if not the last year, is how much I wish I could experience what it was like to be a Sega kid back in the 90s. I grew up in the 90s. I lived through the console wars, the peak of the console wars. I was in the trenches. I was fighting for Nintendo back in the day. I was a grunt on the front lines fighting for Nintendo. And just so happens all of the kids that I grew up near in my complex were all Nintendo kids as well, except for the odd kid here or there. And to be honest, the one Sega kid that I can think of, he wasn't very popular. I think I borrowed his Genesis once, or I think we made a trade once. I let him borrow my Super Nintendo and I borrowed his Sega Genesis. He had Shining Force and Green Dog. Those are the two games I remember playing. Shining Force was really freaking good. Green Dog, the beach surfer dude, not so much. No, that game sucked. Unless you were a Sega kid. Okay, I was into RPGs. If you were a Sega kid, you did sink a lot of hours into that and learn to enjoy that game. I've been thinking a lot about what it would be like to have grown up with the Sega games instead of the Nintendo games. I wouldn't change anything. I was a Nintendo kid and I wouldn't change that for the world because I'm a heavy RPG fan. I'm heavy into the RPGs. I'm a heavy RPG user. So Sega is famous for being very light on the RPG optionality and light on the quality of the RPGs in comparison to games like Final Fantasy and Breath of Fire. Those are the heavy hitters, the top dogs, everybody knows them. Well, no game other than Phantasy Star even came close to the popularity, or I would argue even the quality of, say, Final Fantasy 3 or Chrono Trigger, or even Final Fantasy 2. Like, there's just no comparison. But that said, I also didn't grow up playing Phantasy Star. I don't have nostalgia for that game. So maybe there's people out there that they're heavy into Final Fantasy or Phantasy Star 2 and Fantasy Star 4. Cuz I hear number 3 is garbage, so we're going to skip over number 3. But I've been thinking, man, how different would my life be if I had a Sega Genesis? If that was my main console? Because I wouldn't be RPG heavy, perhaps. Perhaps I would have been heavy into the platformers, the action platformers. I would have been hardcore into Sonic. And I did get to experience Sonic, and I did get to experience the Sega Genesis, but not until later in that life cycle. Might have even been by the time the N64 had already come out, or the PlayStation 1 at least. That's around the time that I finally got a Sega Genesis. I bought it used from a friend, and I only had a couple of games. I was lucky enough that I was able to get X-Men and Sonic. I had very basic games. I had some freaking monster hits too, Mutant League Hockey, but again, not until later in that life cycle. So let's rewind time a bit. Let's pretend you're a Sega kid. So hope if you're a Nintendo kid watching this, let's pretend for a moment that you were a Sega kid. Probably your friends would have been different. I hung out with Nintendo kids. The Sega kids were over there on the other end of the playground. We Nintendo kids, we didn't go near those guys. They were in their world, and I would watch them play sometimes. This is like grade 4, grade 5. I remember they were playing, one of them is Sonic, one of them's Tails, doing weird Sega stuff or cool Sega stuff. But, we didn't have that. We had Super Mario and Final Fantasy and Mega Man. But probably your friends would have been very different. I feel like RPGs make kids smarter, especially with all that classical music. If you were a kid heavy into RPGs, definitely played a role on your intelligence level. I'm telling you. You learn to respect the fine arts of a good story and good music, good classical music. Beethoven, Bach, and Mozart they've done studies to say that if you play that music the babies and for your kids, it helps with their brain development. They get smarter. Well, you give a kid a good RPG, Final Fantasy III for the Super Nintendo, he learns to read. He learns to understand. He learns patience. You got to grind. You learn a lot of life skills just playing an RPG at a young age. But that said, I mean there are RPGs on the Sega Genesis, so my RPGs would have been very different. Instead of my Final Fantasies, I would have been heavy into games like Rings of Power, Buck Rogers, which I'm going to show you right now because I can't hold it in anymore. This would have been my Final Fantasy right here. Buck Rogers, guys. Countdown to Doomsday. Science fiction role playing game. I wasn't into sci fi games, but the Sega Genesis was heavy on sci fi. Shadowrun, Buck Rogers. Look at this. This is CIB. This is my most prized possession. It's not my most expensive game, but it is my best game, my most prized possession of Sega Genesis. CIB, good condition. Look at this. Look at this manual. They don't. Only Sega did this. Super Nintendo didn't give you a manual as thick as a book. Look at that manual. This is a book. This is a novel. This is an entire novel. Buck frickin' Rogers. Just say that out loud. Buck frickin' Rogers. Look at this story. There. Look how many characters. You know how many characters are in here? Well, let me pull up the character page. Where's the character page? Okay, choose your character's career. Available careers for each race. So there's different races. Yeah, let's start with the races. Each race has distinct strengths and weaknesses. Human, Desert Runner, and Tinker. Your careers are Rocket Jock, Medic, Warrior, and Rogue, and only certain races can be certain careers. So only humans can be rogues, for example. And then there's male or female. You roll for your stats at the beginning of the game. That's a old school RPG thing. There's even a basic guidebook at the end to get you started in the game. It's basically a strategy guide. But that's a thick book. This automatically says this game is good. You just look at the book, you know it's a good game. So the RPGs I would be playing would be very different. Holy hell. I would be playing Shadowrun. Oh, hold on, I wrote some down. I'd be playing Phantasy Star. I'd be playing the hell out of that. In fact, I saw Final Fantasy Star 4 at Rogers Video when they were clearing out all the Sega games, which is around the time that I got my Sega Genesis. Actually around the exact time when they were actually selling off. You couldn't even rent them anymore because they were so old now. Phantasy Star, Buck Rogers, Rings of Power, Kadash, Shining Force 1 and 2, Crusader of Senti. Can you imagine if you were a kid and you actually had that back in the day? That's a super rare game. That's like the heaviest hitter on the entire Sega Genesis. Imagine if you had that back in the day, though. Rewind time. It's no longer 2003. It's now like 1996. Or even, maybe some of these are late release games, but imagine it's 1992. And you have all these games. 1991 even, 1993. Pick a year. You have all these games. So your RPG games would be limited. So by default, you would also be heavy into the other types of games. Would I have become a sports fanatic? Sports games were huge on the Sega Genesis. If I had a Sega Genesis back in 1990... I would have probably had Tommy Lasorda Baseball. If you got a Sega Genesis when it first came out, you would have Tommy Lasorda Baseball. It's a garbage baseball game, but it was probably the first release. I think it was a launch title. But it was a popular game back when it came out. It was popular. And it was very different from the NES. It was much faster. Very Sega was famous for having fast-paced sports action. You couldn't get that on other consoles at the time. And in the early days, the Super Nintendo games were much slower paced. The sports games were slower. That's why one of the reasons they say NHL 94 is apparently better on the Sega Genesis. That's what they say. That's what they say. I would have turned into a football fanatic. Football games are huge on the Sega Genesis. Maybe I would have become a sports fanatic. I would have turned into one of those jocks at school. I would have been playing football all day. Would have been pumping iron at the gym. Maybe I'd be ripped. Maybe I'd be jacked right now. Who knows? Who knows? Action games were very popular in general. Sonics. Let's go through the whole list. Sports games in general. Road Rashes. Road Rashes. Dick Tracy. This was an early freaking game. Might have even, I don't think it was launch title. But I know it came out early in the Genesis life cycle. The graphics in this game are mind-blowing. Look at this. Imagine having The Great Circus Mystery starring Mickey and Minnie. They didn't have this on the Super Nintendo. This is two-player co-op. Imagine having that back in the day. Two-player co-op. You could beat that game. Shinobi? I didn't have Shinobi. I didn't get to play Shinobi. You know how many you know how many people love Shinobi? You know how good of a game this is? This is a 10 out of 10 franchise. Sega built a masterpiece with Shinobi. Nintendo kids had no idea. And look at this. Shadow Dancer. That's a heavy hitter. Toe Jam and Earl. There's great co-op games on the Sega Genesis. Probably more and better co-op games on the Sega Genesis than there are on the Super Nintendo. I can name more and better co-op games on that console than I can on the Super Nintendo. Look at this. World of Illusion, starring Disney's Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck. This is one of the best two-player co-op games ever made. And it's easy, but it's not too easy. Good luck beating it on your first try. It's not as easy as it sounds, but it's beatable. Echo the Dolphin. This was actually meant to compete with Metroid. Didn't have a chance in hell at competing with Metroid, but it's a very unique game. They really tried. Shadow Blasters. Hell yeah. Beavis and Butthead? Yeah, sure, this was on Super Nintendo, but Sega Genesis version's a lot better, especially for two-player co-op. Vector Man? Here's Landstalker. See, a lot of the games where they were on both consoles, the Sega Genesis version is always better. Power Rangers the movie. Two-player co-op. Beat 'em up style. Like Streets of Rage style. Beat 'em up. It's a lot better than the Super Nintendo version. And if you're sports heavy, you're about to crap your pants. Put your diaper on. Put your diaper on. I'll give you a minute. I told you you're about to crap your pants. I'm not playing around. You into sports games? Mutant League Football. Mutant League Football. Best football game ever made. And you can play it with people that don't like sports. Mutant League Hockey. Best hockey game ever made. It's not a cheap game anymore. Only on the Sega Genesis. Strider 2. Only on the Sega Genesis. Warrior of Rome. This will fit into the RPG category. Strategy RPG. I played the hell out of this. I couldn't beat the final level, though. I tried so frig. That level is... that's a hard as hell level. I came close, but holy hell, it's hard. Kadash. Streets of Rage 2. Streets of Rage 1, 2, and 3. Better than Final Fight. And you know what's interesting? My friends were telling me about this game back. Two of the Sega kids that I knew were telling me about this game. And I didn't, at the time, I didn't realize that the Sega games were so different from the Super Nintendo. In fact, I was so clueless that I thought I saw this game called Fatal Fury at Roger's Video, and I just assumed that it was the same as Streets of Rage. I don't know why I thought that, but I just assumed, like, oh, yeah, we have that, but it's called something else. It's called Fatal Fury. I think it's the same game, is what I told him. I remember this. I told my friend that. He probably thought I was retarded. Maybe he was right. Quack Shot. This was a monster hit. Monster friggin' hit. Did Capcom make this? No, this is Sega made this. Surprisingly. And now I'll show you one of my favorites. X-Men number 1. Number 2, X-Men number 2. X-Men 1 and 2. X-Men 1 and 2. Where are you going to find a better action platformer? A better action game? You're not going to find one. If you're into X-Men, like, I prefer number 1, but number 2 is 2-player. Wait, this says it's 2-player. Holy hell. I don't even remember playing it on 2-player. Maybe my friend sucked, so I didn't let him play. Dang, man. I did not know that was 2-player. Well, I forgot at least. That's crazy. Friggin' X-Men 1 with 2-player. X-Men 2 was the more famous one for 2-player for some reason. They had fine-tuned a lot of it. Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. So imagine, so I have all of these games now, but imagine if you had them back in the 90s and they replaced all of your Super Nintendo games and they replaced all your NES games. And this is what you had. This is what you grew up on. All these action games, fast-paced games, and the schoolyard talk was Sonic instead, and Sonic and X-Men, and maybe some Mutant League. And Joe Madden football. Or Joe Montana football. John Madden football. Joe Montana was an exclusive. Joe Montana football. That was a big game back then. Joe Montana was like king of the world back then. My friend's dad had a Joe Montana like shrine in his basement of everything every Joe Montana product ever made. And he collected Joe Montana cards. Like 1,000 jerseys, 1,000 cards, any memorabilia that they produced, he purchased it. That's how big Joe Montana was. And here's a gem. Look at this, VR Troopers. Just kidding, the game sucks, but it is funny. Quick funny story. I was gonna buy like 20 copies of this once, just as a joke, and just see if the price would go up. It's an exclusive. NHL 94. Did I show you that? NHL 94. They say the NHL games are better on the Sega Genesis. They just say the football games are better. Now, when you actually conduct an analysis, at least the later football games, they're close enough that you could pick one or the other and it's the same. But Sega kids will tell you they're always better on the Sega. Especially in the early days, they were. So I just wanted to rant about that. Just imagine what life would be like if you weren't a Nintendo kid and you were forced into becoming a Sega kid. You were forced into playing Shinobi all day, every day. Which is not a bad thing, but it's a very different experience from playing Final Fight, Final Fantasy, Breath of Fire, Donkey Kong Country 1, 2, and 3. These are very different experiences. Super Mario Brothers, Super Mario World, Yoshi's Island. These are very different games. No Mario Kart. You wouldn't have that. In fact, Sega really never did come out with a Mario Kart, anything to compete with that. And in many cases where you get same game on both consoles, they're very different games. No Toe Jam and Earl. What are you going to do now? Even your Street Fighter games were different. Very similar, but they were different. Yeah, I'm telling you right now, your friends would be different. I would be a totally different person if I was not a Nintendo kid. Especially because everybody in my complex had Nintendo. I would have been hanging out with that Sega kid. He might be watching this video too. He knows I have a YouTube channel. I'm not going to say his name. He knows. I'm sorry, man, but you were the only one with the Sega. You were the only one. All the rest of us had Super Nintendos. Every single one of us. And you know we all had Super Nintendos. But everybody but you. You had Shining Force 1 and 2, though, and those are great games. Guys, if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. I am legally insane, and I am trying to collect over 9,000 video games, and I've been heavily playing the Sega Genesis lately, trying to play all the games that I never got a chance to play when I was younger, never really got to appreciate. And when I play these games, I go back in time, and I pretend like this is not 2023, this is 1993. Okay, let's play Landstalker with that in mind. And that way you can really appreciate what you're playing.